I'll introduce myself. My name is McDonald. I have been a practicing attorney for the last 23 years, and for the last year and a half, I have been a clinical fellow here at the Texas Tech School of Law in the clinics program. I'm going to take a little different approach. I wanted to visit with you about global ethics in a manner in which involves a story. We have a Minister of Justice who appears at the Texas Tech School of Law from a country that has been war-torn, and I know that's hard for you all to imagine that they're a country that may have some trouble with a war going on, but they're looking at rebuilding their entire judicial system, and she comes here to find out, because Texas Tech School of Law is the top ethics school. She wants to know how we do things here. And so she wants to learn about the structure and regulation of the legal profession in the United States, because in her country, there really are no lawyers, and therefore there's no system for educating or regulating lawyers. Any disputes that they may have in rural areas, they discuss them in village councils, and if you're in the urban areas, they're settled by political officials who are sometimes influenced by bribes. Unfortunately, that's not limited to war-torn countries. That's everywhere, but their contracts and other legal documents are oftentimes drafted by college graduates with no legal training, or in criminal law, it's based on custom, and the police have the authority to impose jail sentences. So she has questions for us when she arrives here at the Texas Tech School of Law, and her first question is, should my country even have lawyers? She notices that American lawyers are much criticized, and people say they're greedy and stir up trouble. So what are the reasons that it might be good to have lawyers? Well, you know, one response would be, ma'am, you're probably right. We don't need lawyers. And you could say that, you know, the government's too big in this country and it's over-regulated, and lawyers promote a lot of that regulation because they make money from drawing up regulations and enforcing regulations. You could also tell the minister that lawyers are too expensive. Nobody can really afford a lawyer anyway. So why would you're at a disadvantage. In this country, I like to tell folks all the time, you get more justice being wealthy and guilty than you do being innocent and poor. So can't afford a lawyer. The next is, people used to need lawyers to find out information, to draft up documents. But now with the internet, you can find a lot of that stuff on the internet. Now, whether or not it's accurate, that's another story. But you can certainly gather information and educate yourself if you have access to the internet. And then there's the argument that maybe it'd just be better if people made their own claims against other folks and they responded to claims that people made against them themselves, as opposed to getting lawyers involved, because when lawyers get involved, things become much more complicated. You take a very simple situation and two people might be able to work it out. You involve lawyers, it becomes much more convoluted, and it takes a much greater amount of time to get that resolved. So yes, there's an argument that we don't need lawyers, but the response to that is, you really can't have a justice system without lawyers because it's too complex for folks to navigate through by themselves. They don't understand the ramifications. I'll give you an example. Here in the U.S., we could have someone who may have gotten a possession of marijuana. Without a lawyer, they go down and say, yes, I'll take my 1 day in jail and move on, never thinking that it'll have any ramifications later. That young person then comes back to go to school at Texas Tech University and they apply for financial aid. Well, because you now have a conviction for possession of marijuana, you're not eligible to receive any federal financial aid. Because you're not a lawyer, you're not trained in those things, you don't realize that just pleading guilty for that day carries greater ramifications than it does. So yes, you would need someone who is trained to be able to explain to you, no, you don't need to do that, because it will hamper you later on. People in businesses need lawyers to give them advice and help them comply with the law. It's not self-executing. You have to actually know how to navigate through these things. And the legislatures, if they made the law and no one read it or helped people understood it, then the law doesn't have any effect. So you have no law if you don't understand what the law is and are able to comply with it. You just have what people thought was going to be a good idea, and because you don't know what it is, it really is ineffective. People need lawyers to be able to assert their legal rights and challenge behavior by other people. Without access, there'd be less accountability. Landlords, merchants, police, no one would be held accountable. People could do whatever they wanted to do, and there's no way to have or seek redress against those folks. Nobody would have any oversight on what's going on. And so as you're talking to that minister, you're explaining to her that this system that we have here holds people accountable for their actions. And in holding people accountable, you then have a system that has some credibility. And that credibility feeds up from the lowest person all the way up to the highest minister. Everybody is treated the same under this system. Lawyers play a fundamental part in constitutional democracy. For people to trust the government, they have to have access to justice, and that's what I was getting at. In order for your government to have credibility, people have to believe that your government is just. If your justice system is not on point, then people have questions about your justice system, which in turn will cause them to have questions about your entire source or sense of government. The minister asked if we have lawyers, how should we train them? You know, she's traveled to other countries. She's seen that in some countries they actually have apprenticeships. Here we have universities that educate lawyers, so she's trying to figure out which is going to be better for her country. If you have an apprenticeship, you know, the benefit is it actually gets you practicing law initially, right off the bat. You apprentice with someone who is licensed or a professional, and you learn the profession from that individual. Those folks who want to go to university are opposed to it. They say, hey, that legal education is too long, it's too expensive, and there's a question about whether or not you actually learn how to practice law when you come to a university setting. And so the response to that is, you know, in a university setting, it teaches us to think critically, which is what you want as a lawyer. You want someone who thinks critically about the issues you present them with. It also helps the students develop skills through experiential learning. Here at the Texas Tech School of Law, we actually have clinics where students can participate in those clinics, and they actually get hands-on experience, much like you would in an apprenticeship. You get hands-on experience representing clients, which will help you, when you leave this place, be prepared to actually practice law. And the other benefit to the university education is that at the end of this fine 3-year time period that you spent here, you get to take an exam to determine whether or not you have the minimal basic skills to be able to practice law. So there's a standard that you have to meet, as opposed to with an apprenticeship, there may or may not be a standard. And so you don't want to just unleash folks onto the public who may not be qualified. Next, your minister is asking, should we have a licensing system? She's been to some places where lawyers have to actually have a license. She's also been to some countries where the apprentice route, you apprentice for a certain amount of time and you're licensed, or you are brought into that profession. And if we're going to have a licensing system, what should we require? And then there's an argument that there should be a licensing system. Public needs protection from greedy, dishonest, or incompetent people who would pretend to be experts. So you need to protect the public by making sure that the folks who are going to be representing the general public, they're licensed, and they're going to charge people. So if you're going to take someone's money, you want to give your money to someone who has actually demonstrated the minimal basic standards in order to go forward and represent you properly. By requiring a license, you then require a gatekeeper to make sure that there's a certain level of knowledge and skill that this person has attained in order to move forward. If you're going to say that it's not needed, you know, they could say that the system in the U.S. doesn't do a very good job of quality control because this same system that requires a license also has encountered many folks who are lawyers who are greedy, dishonest, and incompetent. The difference is if you have a licensing agency, when you run across those people, you can deal with them. And if they continue in that behavior, there are punishments available. If you don't have a licensing system, what do you do with someone who is greedy, dishonest, and cheating the public if you don't have a licensing system? If you use that licensing system, who should be barred from being licensed to practice law? I mean, there are certain places where if you commit certain crimes, you're automatically disqualified from being able to seek a license. Other crimes, you can actually have a hearing, request an opportunity to explain the situation, and still possibly be allowed to practice. Should you disallow people who show evidence of dishonesty? Should it be on a graded scale or a curve? If you are this far dishonest, you don't get to practice, but if you're just a little dishonest, you do. Should you, and that whole deal about the licensing and taking an exam, if you're not intelligent enough to get through law school or pass the exam, should we license you anyway? Those are questions that the minister is going to have to answer when she goes back. Should your country license everybody? There's one argument says you license everybody because there's no reason to limit the number of attorneys that you have. That way it makes sure that there's plenty of availability and options for the public. The other says you limit it because it means that you're going to have quality control and only the best get through and get limited or get licensed. And there's only so much legal business. You don't want to overflood the market with attorneys. And the last thing, how should you have judges selected? Most judges in the U.S. are selected by an election process whereby the judge has to go out and campaign, solicit funds from the very people that will then appear in his or her court as an attorney. Some people have an issue with that. How fair or unbiased can you be when the very person that you're having this discussion with and you're going to make a ruling on their case is the person who donated money to your campaign? Federal judges and other judges in other states are actually appointed for a lifetime, which removes that stigma of having to go out every year or every 4 years and campaign and raise money. Those folks are appointed, they are away from the influence, and they can then just focus on being fair and impartial. So those are some things that you should consider when looking to establish a new judicial system in this country where the minister has come from. Thank you.